Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar called Strengthening Unemployment Protections in America, the Case for a Stronger Federal Role and Opportunities for State Action. My name is Claire McKenna. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at the National Employment Law Project. NELP is a national nonprofit organization that conducts research and advances national, state, and local policies in support of unemployed and low-wage workers. I'll be your moderator today as well as your first presenter. So before we proceed, just let me clarify a couple of administrative items. The webinar is being broadcast through your computer's audio system, but if you're having any trouble hearing, you should feel free to use the call-in number and passcode that I have shown on the slide in front of you as an alternative. We'll take questions in the last few minutes. Please feel free to use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to send any questions for our presenters throughout the session. So just to begin, today's webinar follows the release of a comprehensive proposal developed over the last year by the Center for American Progress, the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality, and the National Employment Law Project. This proposal seeks to strengthen and restore the unemployment insurance program, one of our nation's oldest and most important safety net programs, and to establish a new job seekers allowance for people with more limited work histories. Each of our organizations is committed to bolstering economic security and opportunity for individuals and families. And this proposal really represents the culmination of lots of hard work and bold thinking. And the primary purpose of today's webinar is really to give our state partner organizations and state workforce administrators a better sense of the proposal, which, to be clear, puts the onus on Congress really to shore up state unemployment insurance programs. So just to briefly summarize our proposal, it's split into two major sections. The first section on UI is split further into three subsections, generally focused around reemployment and job retention, benefits, and then financing and the macroeconomic stabilizing role of the UI program. And then of course the second major section outlines the new job seekers allowance. So in addition, I just wanted to quickly remind listeners of the material released to date. In addition to the full proposal, of course, you may also wish to review a shorter executive summary and a two-page fact sheet. And in case you missed it earlier this month, we released an issue brief that recommends steps that states can take to strengthen their UI programs. And it features lots of potentially useful state program and labor market data. So obviously, all of us are here today because we recognize the importance of unemployment insurance. Most obviously, unemployment insurance financially sustains unemployed people while they search for new suitable work. Second, it connects claimants to various reemployment tools. And finally, it sustains the economy during recessions. I think it would be helpful to listeners if I provided just a short background on the federal-state structure of the program, since our proposal seeks to alter that structure somewhat. UI is run jointly by the federal government and state governments. The federal partner sets minimum requirements for state programs, mostly around employee coverage and administration, and these requirements are called federal standards. And they're contained within the Social Security Act and the Federal Unemployment Tax Act. So states design their own programs, usually by enacting legislation, as well as process claims within this relatively broad federal framework. To be clear, under current federal law, states are granted relatively wide latitude in the areas of benefit eligibility, benefit adequacy, and financing. So given this legal framework, we've seen steady erosion over time and significant state variation in metrics like recipiency, rates of wage replacement, and trust fund solvency. As we know, obviously states were quite underprepared for the spike in claims over the recession, and the overwhelming response by legislatures in response to the massive federal debt was really to restrict benefits rather than pass sensible funding improvements. And these actions to restrict benefits and really starve programs for funding, threaten to further weaken the national goals of unemployment insurance. Thus, our proposal advocates a much stronger, more assertive federal role in the federal-state partnership, really by proposing a host of new federal standards for states in major program areas and a greater funding commitment where appropriate. So as you can see, UI was a key safety net for jobless workers this recession. With the federal extensions in effect, more than 2/3 of jobless workers claimed benefits at the height of the recession in 2010. However, in 2014, the first full year without extensions in place, a record low 27% of jobless workers claimed UI benefits, and unfortunately, that record low persisted into 2015. So given by actions by state programs to minimize benefit costs, the system has generally fallen behind changes in the workforce and economy and underserved certain groups of job seekers. And unfortunately for time, I'm going to skip over this slide, but our report kind of details the various ways that eligibility rules in states kind of fail the current workforce. So I'll wrap these introductory remarks just with a final thought for my fellow panelists, my co-authors, and listeners. In theory, state programs that don't meet minimum federal requirements will be cut off of federal administrative funding, and or employers will see their federal UI tax rate jump up to 6%. But in practice, these tools are rarely reinforced, or enforced I should say, because they really would be hugely burdensome for state programs and for a state's employers. So I think just for the future, really any legislative proposal for stronger federal UI standards could benefit from the addition of more effective middle ground enforcement tools for states. So today's webinar features 5 presentations. We have kind of a packed agenda. I'll begin with a summary of the UI recommendations of our proposal focused around reemployment tools and job retention. Rachel West, the Associate Director of the Poverty to Prosperity Program at the Center for American Progress and the report's lead author, will walk through the UI recommendations focused on benefit eligibility, adequacy, and access, and on financing and economic stabilization. Then Kelly Grant, Policy Associate with the Project on Deep Poverty with the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality, and one of the report's authors, will describe the new Federal Job Seekers Allowance proposal. Then we're fortunate to have with us Sharon Dietrich, the Litigation Director at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia and a really long-time advocate of unemployed and low-wage workers in Pennsylvania. She'll provide an assessment of the proposal from a state advocate's perspective. We'll then wrap up with remarks by Jeremy Slevin, Associate Director of Advocacy of the Poverty to Prosperity Program at CAP, who will share strategies to help states advance reforms on their own. So just to begin, the first set of recommendations would expand access to reemployment services and training and reduce layoffs. First, our proposal would significantly increase 2 existing federal funding streams to support expanded access to staff-assisted reemployment services for all job seekers. And I should say that these recommendations are based in part on recent evidence from a reemployment initiative in Nevada during the recession, showing that the provision of these kinds of services can really speed claimant reemployment and reduce overall state benefit payments. Second, our proposal would permit states to allocate some reemployment funding for currently disallowable purposes, including, for example, relocation assistance should a claimant find work in a different region or state. In addition, our proposal would require states to establish self-employment assistance programs for the very small percentage of claimants for whom opportunities to business could be appropriate. The next 2 slides kind of focus on our recommendations in support of stronger job retention measures. So work sharing, as some may know, also known as short-time compensation or shared work, is a type of UI program that helps struggling employers preserve jobs during recessions by allowing them to reduce employee job schedules as an alternative to layoffs. And UI benefits partially replace the lost wages of work-sharing participants until conditions recover. Unfortunately, in spite of strong federal incentives offered between 2012 and 2015, more than 20 states still lack work-sharing programs. And in states with programs, unfortunately, employer participation is very low. Thus, our proposal would require that states have work sharing, and it would provide extra funds to help with setup, and what has been found to be especially employment is outreach to the employer community. So our proposal provides a useful discussion, I think, of how experience rating acts as a job retention tool. As background, employers fund UI benefits by paying state and federal taxes on behalf of their covered workers. And those tax rates vary according to the number of laid-off workers claiming benefits. And this is a mechanism known as experience rating. And the threat of a higher tax rate in the future is really intended to discourage layoffs. But there are, of course, weaknesses in the current system. And so our proposal would raise the floor under the maximum UI tax rate in state so that especially high layoff employers are properly charged for costs they impose on the system. At the same time, we acknowledge that experience rating is currently structured, creates incentives for employers to challenge individual claims. So we feature as a secondary recommendation the possibility of allowing a small number of states to experiment with its elimination altogether. So that concludes my summary for the first section of UI recommendations. Now I'm happy to turn it over to Rachel West of CAP, who will review the second and the third sections of the UI reform proposal. Rachel?
Great. Thank you so much, Claire, for introducing us and for kicking us off. So I'm Rachel. I'm going to talk about the second and third pillars of our UI proposal. So the second pillar, the proposal intends to protect more workers against the shock of unemployment and to make sure that that protection is more adequate than it is today. So protecting more workers during job loss means expanding benefit eligibility within UI. So to do so, we would first establish a federal monetary standard, which would be tied to states' current minimum wages. This would ensure in particular that low-wage workers, folks who put in more hours but have relatively less earnings, are not unfairly excluded like they are in many states today. Next, we would require that all states implement several of the reforms that will be familiar to a lot of folks on the phone from the UI Modernization Act during the Great Recession. So first we would modify the base period over which eligibility is calculated to allow more low-wage workers and folks with erratic schedules and people who've experienced illness or injury to qualify for UI. And second, all states would extend UI protection to part-time workers. And third, all states would allow those who have to quit work voluntarily for compelling personal or family reasons, so for example, escaping domestic violence, to remain eligible for UI even though they haven't been laid off per se. The proposal would also eliminate states' restrictions for temporary and seasonal workers. And it would also establish a more generous federal standard for what's called partial UI formulas. These are formulas that allow claimants who are working part-time while they're looking for full-time work to receive some amount of help from UI. So more generous partial UI would encourage more UI claimants to accept part-time jobs. That keeps them attached to the labor force and helps them supplement what is a pretty meager income from UI, and also in many cases leads as a stepping stone to full-time work. So finally, states should, we recommend, devote more resources than they are doing today to cracking down on misclassification of employees as independent contractors. That means that employers are able to evade paying UI taxes that they owe, but also that their workers are unfairly excluded from UI when they're laid off. All right, so next I'll turn to benefit adequacy, which involves making sure that UI benefits are replacing enough of a worker's wages to provide meaningful insurance, which keeps families out of hardship and poverty when a job is lost. So first and very critically, we would require all states to provide at least 26 weeks of benefits to all of their qualified claimants. 9 states today provide fewer than 26 weeks to everyone as a matter of course, and some states are providing only 13 or 14 weeks. So fewer than 26 weeks in the author's opinions doesn't allow workers enough time to find suitable new employment, particularly when the economy turns down. We would also require states to get rid of what's called the waiting week, which delays delivery of claimant's first unemployment check. Lots of states today use this as a cost savings device, but it really ends up creating hardship for workers who are pretty cash strapped. On the flip side, we propose that states that want to add weeks beyond 26 be rewarded for doing so with a partial federal funding match for up to 39 weeks. Finally, our proposal would establish federally mandated thresholds around around states' weekly benefit levels, so that for most workers, benefits would replace at least half of their wages during the high quarter period, and also federal standards around maximum benefit levels, which would have to be at least half of the average weekly wage in a state. As a final part of this second pillar on providing more protection to more workers, the proposal would also improve benefit access with several measures. So we recommend that states do a better job of informing separated workers of their rights and of the resources available to them, as well as facilitate benefit connections by encouraging employer-filed claims. So both of those are steps that states can take on their own, but that the proposal itself would ask Congress to require of states. The proposal also urges Congress to fully fund UI program administration, which it is supposed to do, but has routinely failed to do, and to much more aggressively enforce the existing federal access standards that we have. So turning now to the macroeconomic stability properties of UI in particular, so this is the third pillar of the report. We would seek to fix UI's financing, and the goal here would be to restore the solvency to the system and to prepare it to face the next recession. So the first thing, as Claire mentioned, UI is funded primarily by two modest payroll taxes, one at the federal and one at the state level. Both are currently very regressive. The federal tax wage base is just $7,000. It hasn't been increased in over 30 years. So to make UI's financing significantly more progressive, our proposal would broaden the federal taxable wage base and link it to half of the Social Security taxable wage base going forward. And by law, this would automatically do the same, broaden states' taxable wage bases to the same degree. States and the federal government could then significantly lower their tax rates to the extent that they wished, so long as they were raising enough revenue to finance their obligations under this proposal. So next, to restore states' trust funds to solvency, we would require that states achieve an average high-cost multiple of 1.0 within 5 years. So the average high-cost multiple means that during recessionary times, states would likely have enough reserves in their trust funds to pay out UI benefits for at least 1 year without having to borrow from the federal government like so many did during the recession. So even though this seems like a relatively reasonable benchmark, fewer than a third of states are there today. Next, to ensure that states' trust funds continue to be solvent after that, the proposal would link the tax rates in states to their trust fund reserves, meaning that if the trust fund dipped below the target, states' taxes would automatically rise a bit in order to offset this. That would be suspended during recessions, but would help ensure solvency during that trust funds are built up during expansions to stay solvent. So on the other hand, as a reward for states that remain solvent, states would receive differentially higher interest payments for their trust fund reserves, and they could spend that money as they wished. And finally, we would ask that states do more to enforce laws against tax evasion practices like pseudo-dumping. So as a final part of this pillar of restoring solvency for macroeconomic stability purposes in particular, we've talked about what we would do to get states solvent during expansions, and now what happens when an actual recession arrives? What measures do we want to have in place? So first and foremost, the proposal would repair what's called the Extended Benefits Program, which is the program that provides additional weeks of benefits for long-term unemployed folks when jobs become scarce during a recession. So notably, we propose full federal funding for extended benefits. Right now, the funding is split with states. We would end that. And second, we would create more benefit tiers, so more additional weeks when hard times hit, and would improve the triggers that turn on the extended benefits program, relying on the total unemployment rate instead of the insured unemployment rate as the program does today. So that would make the program more responsive to economic conditions. So a few other measures during recessions, the proposal would ensure that all long-term unemployed individuals who were receiving benefits, extended benefits during a recession, had access to reemployment services and eligibility assessments, as Claire described, to help them seek new employment. We would also encourage work sharing among states during recessions by having the federal government pay for work sharing benefits for at least a year in states that trigger on to EB, extended benefits. And then finally, we would adjust federal and state taxes to be countercyclical so that workers and businesses would experience sort of automatic tax relief when a recession arrives. So with that, I will turn it over to Callie, who will talk about the second portion of the proposal, which has to do with the federal job seekers allowance.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Claire. I'm Callie Grant from the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality, and for the next 10 minutes or so, I'm just going to cover a few things about the new job seekers allowance, from why we need it in addition to an expanded UI program, what the benefit would look like and who it would help, and what we know about similar programs in other countries. So even under our expanded UI proposal, where a significantly larger share of all unemployed workers would be eligible, UI will never reach everyone who needs it. In considering the holes in the safety net left from dwindling programs like TANF and general assistance, we wanted to propose a new federal means-tested program to reach a greater share of these workers and their families and to help close some of the gaps in the safety net, while also, of course, incentivizing new and continued and renewed attachment to the labor force. So this new program that we're proposing, the Job Seekers Allowance, would be a parallel and complementary program to UI. So in the next few slides, like I said, I'll get into what would make the JSA different from UI, including the population it will serve, eligibility requirements, the types of benefits and services it will provide, as well as how it compares to similar programs in other countries. So who could get JSA? JSA is a way to get more workers in every state access to sufficient income and reemployment support, including those who may have limited recent work histories, such as independent contractors and gig economy workers. They could also be caregivers who are returning to the labor market. They could also be young people who, after completing school or a training program, are looking for work. And of course, workers who have exhausted their UI benefits. And to make sure that costs are limited and that the program is targeted appropriately and to the people who would be most likely to benefit from it, there would be a few requirements, both in terms of financial, including a means test, as well as some job search requirements, which would mirror those of UI and be just as strict. And in addition, there would be some time limits put into place. So within a period of, within each rolling 5-year period, a worker would be limited to 52 weeks. And of course, there would be exceptions for cases of extreme hardship, such as domestic violence or victims of natural disasters. And during recessions, time limits would be suspended. And states would also have the option to modify the time restrictions to make them more generous if they so chose to. So now I'll talk a little bit about the benefit itself. It would be a uniform stipend of around $170 per week, which is about half of the typical low-wage workers' wages, indexed to the 10th percentile of wages. And participants would be eligible to receive this for up to 13 weeks. And this modest stipend is intended to just help workers meet some of the basic needs and job search related costs like transportation, interview clothes, whatever else they may need it for. And all JSA participants would be able to receive this stipend until they either found employment or reached the 13 weeks of job searching. And I'll get more into how that would work on the next page, what would happen once they met the 13 weeks. And an additional interesting part of this is that if a participant found employment that would require relocation before they had reached their 13 weeks, they would actually be allowed to use the remaining balance of their allowance to subsidize that relocation. So this would allow participants to search across a wider range of employers and find a better match in terms of a job, which could also then, of course, lead to higher wages and more stable employment. So to talk a little bit more about the services that participants would receive, there are actually two paths, and that all applicants upon applying would be screened for placement into one of these two program pathways for meeting the employment-related requirements. The first path, which the majority of placements would happen, is the job search and career ladders, and the second path, which is for a smaller subpopulation, would be individualized mobility strategies. So for path one, it's job search supports, career-specific training and education opportunities, and participants during the 13 weeks would look for employment, and they could also be allowed to search for part-time work, which would help populations such as workers who are primary caregivers for a young child or workers with disabilities. If a worker gets to the 13-week limit and still has not found employment, they would be directly routed into a platform to employment style intensive engagement model, where they would continue to be able to receive JSA benefits and would also receive access to opportunities like subsidized employment, additional training, and the like. Now, even among these workers who are able, available, and actively searching for work, there will be, of course, a subset of individuals who are facing significant barriers to work, which this could be homelessness, mental health or substance abuse problems, or domestic violence. For these workers, we wanted to create an alternative path that would still provide the same work and wraparound supports that participants in Path 1 would get, but they would get additional supports in the form of a navigator who would work with them to create an individualized plan, and they would also connect to even more substantial wraparound services such as mental or behavioral health services. If they exceeded the 13 weeks, they would be eligible for an additional 13 weeks of benefits, which would count towards their JSA time limit. In both paths, so workers who are either in Path 1 or Path 2, they would have access to work supports such as child care and transportation assistance, as well as legal aid services to help with other barriers to work, such as expungement, improving credit reports, and other similar issues. And just like with our proposed UI trigger, the JSA would also include a countercyclical trigger during times of high employment, which would automatically facilitate proportionally more weeks of benefits. So JSA participants would be able to get additional weeks of JSA that would not count towards time limits, even for those who have already reached these limits during these periods of high unemployment. So how JSA would help workers and their families and the economy. JSA would help workers and their families because it would quickly connect people to both jobs and job preparation tools, and it would also discourage workers to come back into the labor market. Even such a modest amount of income and plus the wraparound services would really help job seekers be able to hold up for the right job rather than having to accept a low-quality job out of desperation. And it could also help them relocate for an even better work opportunity. In addition, a well-designed and well-implemented program could also potentially reduce the duration of receipt for other public benefits and increase their taxable earnings. So it gives families mobility and stability during what can be a very stressful time. And it could also even reduce the risk and degree of hardship during and reduce income stability. As for the economic effects of the JSA, JSA's effects would both multiply and amplify those of UI. So similar to UI, JSA would enhance the automatic stabilization function of the tax and transfer system. This means that during and following a recession, the JSA would likely have similar multiplier effects to other programs that are serving those who are in tough places, such as SNAP did during the last recession. So finally, when we proposed this, we knew that there were several examples of similar programs in other countries that had a fairly good success. So in the United Kingdom, they do have an income-based job seekers allowance, which is similar to the JSA proposed in our report, which complements their equivalent of RUI, which is a contribution-based JSA. And so for the UK's JSA, the weekly benefit varies by the age and the marital status, and it's also available to less than full-time workers. And while it is notable that their weekly benefit is significantly less generous than ours would be, so it's about 65 to 85% of our proposed US JSA, this is because they have a much more robust safety net in their country, and such as housing and child benefits. So they don't need to make the JSA fill quite as many holes as we do. In addition, theirs is available for up to 6 months, which is twice as long as what we're proposing for JSA recipients. And then in Germany, they have a multi-tiered UI system, and their Tier 2 closely resembles our proposed JSA. And their Tier 2 is meant to help workers who can't work or who have not been able to find work but are available to look for work. And so this system definitely offers a lot of lessons about developing additional alternative forms of income and reemployment support for other workers who fall outside of standard UI roles as well, because they also have an additional separate tier of means-tested social assistance benefits for workers who are not even eligible for Tier 2 benefits, either due to a disability, illness, or caregiving obligations. So to sum up, just how does JSA compare to UI? JSA is a parallel and complementary program that would differ in terms of populations it's serving, the benefits and services it's providing, and the criteria required for eligibility, as well as its administration and financing. But overall, together, the two recommendations, the two programs would help to ensure that unemployed job seekers in every state have access to sufficient income and reemployment supports. So thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Claire, the moderator.
Thanks so much, Kelly. Now Sharon Dietrich of Community Legal Services of Philadelphia will share her very valuable feedback of the proposal. So Sharon, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Claire, and I want to thank all the authors of the paper for this opportunity to provide feedback on it. I really enjoyed studying it. I advise that you all take the time to work your way through it. It's a very extensive report, but it rewards close attention. And I'm especially impressed that they agreed to allow me to comment on this proposal without knowing what I was going to say about it. So let me start by just raising the question about the political environment in which this proposal is introduced. We, as you know, are in an election cycle in which there's a lot of discussion about a populist reaction against bad jobs, and that much to the amazement of some who don't focus on the issues that most of us do, people are upset about the fact that jobs are not what they used to be, and that they're basically out there going it alone. If they have a job that does not bear up to what they need, it's up to them to figure out their way out of that. Seems to me that UI reform has a role in this discussion, this newly political discussion, and perhaps even though advocating for a proposal like this is a heavy lift, this is a time to do it. So thanks to the authors for having come up with this very valuable model at just the right time. When I wrapped my mind around the proposal, one of the things that I did was identify a number of themes that I thought were notable and that I would like to share with you. First of all, there are two themes that are based on the changing nature of work. Erratic work schedules is something that we've heard about quite a bit in policy circles in the last couple of years. I think lesser the theme of lack of savings, and particularly among the unemployed and what that means for an unemployed person. On the policy side, the themes that flow through the report are both the need for federal standards and the increased role that federal funding for UI would have. As the prior speakers have made clear, UI is a joint federal-state program, but up to this point, it's really mostly the states that have controlled it. And if this proposal were adopted in part or in full, that would change things. Okay, first of all, theme number one, erratic work. There are a couple of solutions that are put forward in the proposal for the erratic work idea. One is that states could make erratic work and the harm that it causes to the workers with erratic schedules to be a basis for good cause to quit their jobs and get unemployment benefits. Love that idea. That would expand good cause from where we have traditionally seen it, even in states that have a broad standard of good cause for quitting one's job. And I love the idea more broadly that UI could be a place where new harmful employment practices could be disincentivized. So I wanted to draw attention to that particular recommendation. I wanted to mention that there's an issue around erratic work that has not been addressed in the proposal, and just to flag it, the complicated issue around wage reporting when somebody is earning ever different wages every week. Those of us on the ground frequently see that there are horrific impacts on claims when a person's income has to be reported every week and it's not the same, and the employer is reporting something different, and maybe the time period, the week for purposes of the UI system and the week for the employer's payroll don't match up. So I think it's also important for the system, and particularly for DOL, to start to look at some smoothing of the reporting requirements, as has been done in other public benefit systems such as SNAP and Medicaid. Because in addition to the other things that are suggested, that's something I think could make the situation of people with erratic work better in the UI system. Okay, next theme, lack of savings. And I encourage you to look at what the report says about the research on lack of savings in recent decades. It certainly is something that we have seen in our program with our representation of clients, but again, I hadn't really seen it so much in this policy realm. I want to point out in particular the way that lack of savings impacts reemployment. Because we in our legal aid program frequently see clients who are forced to pony up money for things that they need in order to get jobs that they simply may not have the money to pay for. Background checks, expungement filing fees, maybe even fines and costs in a criminal case in order to get a case expunged if they could make a loan for that. Uniforms, interview clothes, phones, texts, resume copying, faxing, These are all issues that we see our clients have, and I'm very grateful to see that the recommendation is that there would be funds available for reemployment. I would urge that potentially this notion be pushed further to those kinds of expenses that might stand in the way of somebody becoming reemployed. The next thing, federal standards. I won't say a lot about this. Many of the standards you've heard about in the first half hour today, according to the proposal, would be federal standards that the states would have to comply with. I think we are at a point where this is very necessary because we are just seeing an increased race to the bottom as all the states try to be, quote unquote, more competitive with the state next to them. But this will not be easy because this is a program that's been structured the way it has for the last 80 years or whatever since the New Deal. But I strongly support this notion of the proposal. And finally, among our themes, federal funding. I think it's very important that we are seeing more discussion of federal funding. In the early go of the unemployment program, it's been almost entirely employer funded, and there are great policy reasons for that. But I would argue that the fact that the employers carry the weight also means that they are very aggressive in their lobbying efforts to curb costs. And that's part of the reason that we find ourselves in the position that we are today. So it's great that JSA would be federally funded. I think it's great that EB would be fully federally funded. I'm sure our state programs would all trigger on much faster if it were federally funded instead of half state funded as it is now. It's great that federal funding would be used as an incentive for some of these other policy recommendations that we would like. Top issues in my opinion, and I see we're already running short on time, so I'm going to start to fly through some of these slides. I would argue that these are my top 3 issues that are discussed in the report. That might surprise some of you, but I'll explain why I think these are important. Financing and solvency. It is about the least sexy issue to work on, and we'd all rather work on expanding benefits. But I think what many of us, if not all of us, saw coming out of the Great Recession was that when our programs went broke, that was an opportunity for the employers to permanently cut back on eligibility and on benefit levels. And with another recession, doubtlessly not too distant in the future, I think it's very important that we all look at our state trust funds and what kind of condition that they're in. So I think that the financing part of the proposal is particularly worth everyone's attention, and I particularly like the idea that there would be a federal standard for trust fund balances. State program administration. It's something that those of us who deal with UI on a daily basis have in our minds all the time, because our state programs are run so poorly these days, and I can't say enough about the importance of this issue, because you could have the best eligibility criteria in the world, but if people can't get through on the phone, if they can't file their claim online, they're not going to get benefits. Federal financing, which comes through FUTA, has not kept pace with what the states need, and this is a very serious issue for us to focus on. In particular, in addition to federal funding, I think that we need to see the Department of Labor be more aggressive about trying to enforce standards and making sure that claimants, unemployed workers, have access to the benefits that they're eligible for. Finally, I want to comment a little bit on the job seekers allowance. I love it, like I'm sure most of you do. Obviously, those of us who work in other areas involving benefits have seen rhetoric around welfare. And one caution that I wanted to raise was that I'm sure opponents to this proposal will call it another form of welfare. And I think that the rhetorical way around that is indeed to emphasize the labor market connection that is required here. The one concern I had about this proposal, and I don't know whether it's a valid one or not, is that if there is another program side by side that provides for benefits, even low benefits, that is federally funded, I can imagine that it would be possible that some states would try to push their unemployed into that program. So we want to be careful about any counter incentives. Real quickly, let me say that, well, let me just skip these slides since my time is running late. What's missing from the vision that this paper provides? Most notably to me, from the perspective of somebody who sees the program on a daily basis in operation, is that it doesn't discuss the role of overpayments. And that has been something that DOL has driven the states in the wrong direction, in my opinion, in the last couple of years, and something that needs to be re-examined. People are being basically precluded from future use of the program by the fact that they're getting an overpayment now that will follow them for years, if not for their entire work lives. I would also really like to see consideration of an increased role for employee taxes in this system and away from the employer taxes for the reasons that I raised earlier, in part that employers would have less incentive to lobby for bad changes to the program, and employees would have more of a sense of skin in the game and be more aware of UI benefits and feel like they have a right to UI benefits. We have a small employee tax in Pennsylvania, and I strongly feel that it is well worth it because of the fact that our program is as well utilized as it is. Finally, ways to get this done. I think the incentivizing of behavior, especially with federal funds, is an excellent way. I think that messaging is very important. The acceleration of the race to the bottom, the historic lows of both receipt and benefit levels that the report lays out, those would both be addressed by the federal standards, because then there would be no reason to have competition to try to get to the bottom first. And I think spotlighting states like, unfortunately for our friends in Florida and North Carolina, those, because they're now hovering at 11 to 12% recipiency, really shows the need for a floor. And they're not the only ones. There are a number of states that are much closer to 10% recipiency than 50%. And I even raised the question of whether their programs warrant the FUTA credit, because it's almost as though they're not running real programs anymore. So thank you, and I now turn the floor over to our last speaker.
Great, thank you, Sharon. Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Go to the next slide. There we go. So I'll real quick. I'm just going to go over some tactics you guys can take on your own at the state level to elevate this proposal. So first, we have a resource that's geared particularly towards states that's up on AmericanProgress.org, where states are and where they should be on unemployment protection. And one of the really helpful resources is that you can see exactly where your state is on a number of different metrics. This will not only be helpful for advocates, but for legislators and state executives as well. I encourage you to share this resource with local officials. It also goes over several policies that can be done through executive action without legislation at the state level. Three of those, just real quickly, are reemployment services, cracking down on worker misclassification. A lot of full-time workers are misclassified as independent contractors, and a governor can easily reclassify that. And the last one is SUTA dumping, which just means companies circumventing paying unemployment taxes in the states. Moving on to some kind of advocacy tactics, as I mentioned earlier, really just sharing the state of the state's resource with your local officials is just a great first step. You'll be surprised how many local officials do not know where their state is and how meager their benefit levels are. And secondly, educating policy makers on both the work sharing program, which is a huge component of our proposal, which Claire talked about, and those state executive actions that I just mentioned. A good opportunity coming up, especially if you're going to have a new governor in your state, is getting these proposals in transition memos. We recognize that UI may not be the top ask of a new governor, but especially if a recession comes, which we believe is inevitable, it's really important to just get state officials thinking about these issues ahead of time. Other venues for voicing your interests include the National Governors Association, along with the Democratic and Republican Governors Association, and the National Association of State Workforce Agencies, and of course the state appointment process, because the people who will actually be running the UI programs in the state are probably the most critical people to win over and have a lot of leeway on their own. There we go. Moving on to some resources we have and ways we can help you guys elevate this proposal at the state level. The Center for American Progress, we have a story bank where we collect personal stories on UI and all of our other priorities. These have been featured on our own TalkPoverty platform, which I'm going to talk about in a second, as well as the New York Times and other national outlets. And we've done lobbying days on Capitol Hill with some of our storytellers. I put the contact for my colleague Michael Richardson up there, who runs our story bank. Feel free to reach out to him if you have advocates or storytellers you want to surface to us. And to dive into a little more detail, we have our own media outlet, TalkPoverty.org, that I work on along with my colleague Greg Kaufman, who used to be a correspondent at The Nation, and that is dedicated to featuring voices people who've been affected by poverty in America, as well as policymakers. We featured Elizabeth Warren, Tom Perez, Melissa Harris Perry, to name a few. We also feature people directly affected by UI. Christy Martino is a great advocate who we released her story when this UI report came out. As you can see, she had to get unemployment insurance in 2 different states and was affected by the drastically different standards in each state. Lastly, literally any resources you need, we can help with if you're launching a campaign at the state level. So we have media training at CAP. We can help with op-ed writing and even placement. We have a government affairs team. Aaron Cohan does a lot of the state work and is really helpful and helps a lot of our partners. And that's it. My contact is up here. If you have any questions or want to start putting this into motion in your state, feel free to reach out to me.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeremy. And just let me take a moment to, of course, thank all of our panelists today. There were some really useful insights shared in what is obviously a very short period of time. So we really only have 5 minutes left, and so I will just I guess I'll start with a comment to Sharon. I mean, I think you raised a point that often policy experts and researchers are not are sort of less acutely aware of, and that's kind of the sort of recent the sort of focus from the federal level on UI program integrity and on identifying and penalizing fraud. And so I just sort of want to take a second to sort of appreciate those comments, especially because we don't really take really much space or any space in the report to talk about program integrity. So thank you. I guess we have a question, and I wanted to direct this at Callie, but anyone else on the call should feel free to answer it. But it's a question about the job seekers allowance, and a question from one of the listeners is, would the job seekers allowance be a standalone program, or would it be more like an add-on program under unemployment insurance?
This is Callie. I can take a stab at this question. So when we were thinking about UI and JSA within the system of unemployment supports for workers, we really did want JSA to be a parallel and complementary program to UI. And what was really important was we wanted to preserve UI as the important earned social insurance program that it is, and one that any qualifying worker who has contributed to it, regardless of income or family means, could have access to. Whereas with JSA, the important difference is that it's not conditional on contributions from participants. And so because it's really, they're both serving different but parallel purposes, that's how we try to think of them as well.
Great.
And I don't know if one of my co-authors wants to chime in and add anything else to this point.
I actually had another question, Callie, if you could clarify. Would JSA participants be able to work while they're receiving the job seekers allowance?
Yes, they can work while they're receiving the job seekers allowance, and it's part-time work is actually available, and there's an earnings disregard of up to 50% of the JSA benefit, weekly benefits, and after that, I think it decreases at a proportional rate. So yes, there is some part-time work allowed as well, and this would enable workers like independent contractors who maybe aren't getting as much work as they wanted to, and so they're looking for other opportunities but don't want to completely sever the current, albeit smaller, opportunity that they have to keep working and keep up a little bit of income. So.
Great. And I think earnings disregards are so important, and Rachel kind of shared the recommendation we have just around partial unemployment insurance formulas and strengthening those in the standard unemployment insurance program. We have just a minute, and I'll just answer what is a final question from a listener. She had a question just about the recommendation to eliminate existing exclusions that shut out temporary agency workers from getting unemployment insurance benefits. So just to be clear, temporary workers, when they complete an assignment, are often required to report back to the agency where they worked, or else they are deemed to have quit without good cause and are disqualified from getting benefits. And so we would eliminate that requirement that temporary workers report back for a new assignment that to the temporary agency that laid them off, and states would have to treat the end of a temporary assignment as an involuntary termination of employment. That really concludes our webinar today. I don't want to keep everyone. It's now a minute past our allotted time. But I just want to, again, thank you, all of our excellent panelists. And just please let me say thank you to all of our listeners for your time and participation today.